Good morning. I'm Amanda Brock. I'm the CEO at OpenUK. And this morning I'm going to talk to you a bit about AI and open source. I just want to start by thanking Richard for pulling this event together, bringing you all together. And it was really great when I was watching him present and looking at his slides to see how many UK companies are there. I've been in open source for the best part of 20 years, and it's been a challenge to get engagement in the UK. And we've seen this sort of mass adoption of open source as part of the software stack over the last 5-10 years. Richard talked about companies like Kodak that had failed because they didn't digitize. And it's just been incredible to see the adoption of open source globally, where you're now in a position where over 90% of all commercial stacks are dependent on open source software. They run dependencies. And over 70%, roughly 76%, is actually open source. So it's quite incredible now to see the list of companies that he's got up there who are acknowledging their use of open source and engaging in that open source community. So I'm going to start by just telling you very briefly about me, about the organization I run. I'm then going to talk to you about the open source community here in the UK and globally, and what open source is all about. Then I'm going to talk to you, and I think it's quite relevant with Richard referring constantly in his presentation to the fact that as well as a paid service, that they are built on open source. And then I'm going to talk to you about AI, and I'm going to talk to you about what's happening in AI globally and in the UK and Europe in terms of open source creation and contribution. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about what's happened over the last couple of years and how that impacts open source. And if I have time, which is a hit or miss, I'm going to talk to you about some of the challenges that open source projects are facing. So about 3 years ago, this book was published. I'm the editor. I'm not trying to flog you my book. It's actually available open access, and the easiest way to get the open access copy is to use this QR code. And it's a bit of an oxymoron, right? Because I'm talking to you about a book that is the leading textbook, not because I edited it, but because it's got 26 leaders from law and policy and open source who contributed to it. And when we put together the content of that book, we did not include AI because we did not think it was relevant. So 3-4 years ago, AI wasn't even in the landscape in open source. And my background is that I was a lawyer for 25 years. I got into open source in 2008 with a company called Canonical, who many of you will know, the sponsor of the open source operating system Ubuntu. I was the head lawyer, the general counsel there for 5 years, and then worked in other open source companies from that point on and open source projects. And OpenUK is an industry organization. We sort of break the model in that we focus on people, not companies, so we don't have a membership structure. And we bring the open source community in the UK together, and then and when I say community, I'm talking about that enterprise community, and contribution community, so it's not just the coders. And then we also work with law and policy, where we respond to legislative proposals, trying to make sure that the UK is a great place to do open source. AI has obviously become a huge focus for us, and I'll explain to you why in a minute. These are a couple of reports we've produced. The first one here was in July this year, looking at the AI landscape. Again, the AI openness landscape globally. It's quite in depth. It reviews everything that's been written, I think 29 reports up to July of this year. And then I was at the AI Action Summit. I'm going to talk to you very briefly about those summits towards the end. And those summits are government's way of trying to build global governance and global leadership in AI. So if you're interested in either of those from an openness perspective, you can download those free. Just to start with, open source, what is it? Well, historically, we've very much been tied by a legal definition. And that legal definition is that you have code where the source is publicly available and which is licensed on an open source license. And to be an open source license, it has to comply with the open source definition. And the open source definition is stewarded by its guardian, the Open Source Initiative. You probably noticed their logo on Richard's slide deck. Now, when you look at that as a definition, the criticality of it, the bit that if you take nothing else from me talking to you today, the bit I'd love you to take away is that what makes open source work is that anyone can use the code for any purpose, which creates a free flow in the code. And that free flow is frictionless. You don't have to go back and get a special license at some point in time because you've got a certain number of users. You're not restricted in how you can use it. Now, you have to use it in compliance with law, but from a licensing perspective, anyone can use the code for any purpose. If you introduce a commercial restriction or another restriction, that is not open source. It might still share the source code, but it's not open source. Now, when we look at the UK, we've got 4.1 million, about a year ago, last time this was publicly released, 4.1 million GitHub accounts. GitHub accounts don't necessarily mean that you've got open source developers and contribution, but it does demonstrate collaborative working. Now, it's the way that numbers of contribution are measured everywhere in the world. And here in the UK, we crunch data. Every 3 months, OpenUK looks at who's contributing, where they're contributing, what projects they're contributing to, where in the UK they are, and a whole load of other, very granular data. But universally, these GitHub figures are what we use to compare the landscape across the globe and in specific countries. And 4.1 million is nothing. The US at the same time had about 14 or 15 million. I think India had 18 million. However, when we take that back to a per capita basis, you see 6.1% of the UK population holding GitHub accounts at that moment in time. Now, that is the highest per capita figure in the world, which shows you the engagement around building and using open tools in the UK. When we flip that into AI, and looking here at AI, we're looking at repos with 1,000 plus GitHub stars, which have an AI label and which are licensed on an OSD compliant license. And you can see, unsurprisingly, both the US and China way ahead. But then when you look at, I suppose it's tier 2, when you look at that sort of third place figure, you see the UK. And we're relatively far ahead of the rest of Europe, apart from France, apart from Germany, rather. France is fastest growing by far when you look at either open source software or open source AI. And if you focus down into the European countries, you can see top 3. When we look at the UK, we can see the growth. And obviously, from 2011, it's a dramatic growth. Now, we use GitHub for this. And we use GitHub, not Hugging Face, not because we don't know Hugging Face exists, but Hugging Face doesn't capture IP addresses, so you can't geolocate where repos and contributors are, which is problematic. Even GitHub isn't 100% reliable, but we do see good growth here in the UK. And when we look at what those repos are, and this was surprising to us the first time we did it, we found significant gravitas, AutoGPT. I don't know if any of you know AutoGPT. It's an open source agent. It was also the fastest growing open source repository anywhere in the world last year. So, really significant that that's sitting with a team in Scotland, and we had no idea it was a Scottish creation. Looking at what that is percentage-wise in growth, rather than looking at numbers, you see India, then France in terms of fastest growing, UK at 19%, Germany 14%, but when you aggregate that across Europe, partly due to France's growth, you get UK at 19%, France at 15%. And then when we look at the opposite side of it, and we look at downloads, you can see in the 12 months to 31st of May, 20,000. In May, we see 8,500. Now, when we did the review of all the literature, other people's research was showing that the pace of adoption of AI that is open was much slower than the pace of adoption of open source. And having been in this space for about 18 years, I would wager that that's down to risk professionals. And what we used to have as a challenge with open source software was that finance, legal, procurement would stop us getting it adopted. They would be a blocker. They wouldn't allow it in the organization because they didn't fully understand the risk. And the easiest thing is to say no. And we've seen a huge shift in the last 10 years, obviously in open source, partly because of digitization, partly because of engineering control and the engineers being able to bring the code into the organization. So I expect we will see a shift like that in AI, and you'll see more and more adoption of AI that's open. When we look at contribution from individuals, you see the UK there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think in this one, 7 when it comes to AI projects. Generally, when we look at software, we are 5th, sometimes 4th, project by project. So the average for our contribution in open source is about 5th. We would love to see more investment from the UK public sector to make it easier for us to have a higher ranking, more skills, more funding. But we're further behind when it comes to Gen AI than we are in software. And just going back to that agentic, to AutoGPT, when you look at agentic repositories, they've got a slightly different landscape. There's obviously a lot less, despite it being the buzzword. US 114, UK only 8 at the time. AutoGPT, as I've said, is up there as a top one. And when you compare something like AutoGPT, which is an agent, a general purpose agent, versus DeepSeek, which is an LLM, and I am comparing apples with pears, so completely honest about that, what you see is a huge difference. You all know what DeepSeek R1 is, right? You all saw what happened in January. You couldn't avoid it, but you probably mostly haven't heard of AutoGPT. And then when we compare the two, when you look at contributions from, or commits, contributors and commits, it significantly outpaces DeepSeek, yet we never hear the UK owning this or talking about it. So we're looking at slow adoption of AI that's open. Inevitably, that will change. And I guess for many, we're looking at a myth of openness in AI. And I'm going to explain to you why there's a myth around this. I think prior to GPT-4 in March 23, nobody was really in that AI buzz, right? And for me, when ChatGPT-4 came out, people started to get really excited. I was constantly on calls where people were saying, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. It actually is a usable AI tool, and it's the first time I've really seen one. And of course, when they set up OpenAI, it was supposed to be an open organization. You probably haven't escaped things like Sam Altman being dismissed by his board last November because their structure is for an open source not-for-profit. So there have been consequences for Altman of having set that up and moved away from it, one of which is the sort of perpetual friction with him and Elon Musk. There have been a number of litigations and things started by Musk around the fact that OpenAI isn't open source and that Musk was an initial investor. Now, that's sort of relevant to us because the name OpenAI, which has a trademark, stops us using OpenAI for open AI. So for AI that is open, we have to refer to it as AI openness, open innovation, open source AI. And the industry started using this term open source AI pretty quickly. And that's caused a lot of friction that I'll sort of come back to as I take you through the timescale of the last couple of years. So hot on the heels of ChatGPT-4, we saw LLaMA, the first model that came out of Meta. And LLaMA was released on a license that wasn't open source, but allowed for usage of LLaMA across the academic communities. And it was leaked. Who knows how you leak an LLM? Lots of people have been asking Zuckerberg how it got leaked over a long period of time. But between that March-April leak and May, the world shifted. And the world shifted because that open, collaborative developer community, the folks who wanted to collaborate around AI but didn't have the resources to build an LLM, suddenly had the ability to innovate. They had access to an LLM. They shouldn't have had access. It wasn't properly licensed, but they did. And what you saw between that March-April period and May was a pace of innovation that was unprecedented. And this is a leaked memo from Google that many of you will have seen in May 24. It's such a short period of time, it's hard not to get confused on the years and months. But by May 24, I think 3 months after the release of May 23, 3 months after the release of ChatGPT-4, you were seeing the big techs scared. You were seeing companies that rely on a closed model which returns the massive investment they've made in AI, worrying about how they are going to compete. And when the leaked memo, which is one person's opinion and doesn't necessarily reflect all of Google's, but when that memo was leaked with this, we have no moat, the moat they were talking about was protection through IP. We have no way of stopping this once it's out in the open, and we have no way of getting people to pay us for AI that doesn't really differentiate itself from stuff people can get for free. So by sort of 3-4 months after that, there was this huge panic, and we saw Mark Zuckerberg starting to talk about open sourcing AI. At least that was how the press referred to it. Now, OpenUK, organization I run, was in a unique position. We partnered with Meta on the launch of LLaMA. and we're the only open source organization that did it. We're only 5 years old, so from day one, we focused on open technology, software, hardware, data, ultimately standards and AI as part of that. And we saw what Meta were doing with LLaMA in opening it up as a good thing. We'd seen this innovation, we'd seen the way the growth had happened, we'd seen the potential. And we also read the LLaMA community license before we saw this release. And this is what we committed to. We committed to supporting the launch of LLaMA 2 as open innovation. Now, why is open innovation not open source? It's open innovation because the license for LLaMA has restrictions in it. So do you remember what I said to you right at the beginning about anyone can use this code for any purpose if it's open source software? You would imagine that the same would follow through for open source in AI or AI that's open source. All the way through to launch, it was carefully framed as open innovation because LLaMA has restrictions. When you hit 700 million users, and that's a lot of users, there is a requirement to stop and go and speak to Meta and pay for a commercial license. So if you are building on LLaMA just now, and you're building something that you think could be the next hot thing, if you are the winner, Meta has skin in the game in your business because you will have to go back, whoever wins, and give Meta a cut of it on undisclosed terms. Now, that is why there has been so much friction around what open source and AI is. Carefully described as open innovation to the point of release, at which point Mark Zuckerberg on July 18, 2023 put this post out describing LLaMA as open source AI. Because we were a supporter of the launch, we were in the middle of it, and I've done loads of press and public speaking around it, and this all led to about a year of this massive battle. Now, I'm a nerd. I've worked in open source for a long time. Mostly people's eyes glaze over when I talk to them about open source, right? At dinner parties and things, it's not a hot topic for most people unless they want their kids to be tech billionaires. And if you look at this, this is from The Economist, and open source and open washing made the front page of the New York Times and The Economist, and something that I just would never believe would happen. Because there are these claims of open washing and this battle about what open source is in AI. Now remember what I told you about OpenAI. We would have called it OpenAI. That would have been the logical thing for the open source community to call this, to differentiate it from open source, but we haven't been able to. And there is a lot of confusion about the principles of open source and the meaning. Personally, this is not my favorite thing, but the open source community through the OSI have tried to create a separate definition. Very hard to do, hasn't had a lot of adoption, and it's still evolving. We've seen a lot of academic research into open washing, and we've seen it through organizations like Radboud University. They take an approach that I really like. So what they do is they look at 14 components. At that stage, it was all about the LLM, not agentic. They look at 14 components of LLMs, and they look at whether they're fully open on a proper open source license that meets the open source definition, whether they're partially open, or whether they're closed. They then did a survey using those 14 criteria against 40 LLMs, and you would be shocked when you look at the table. Even ones that you think are open are almost all red. So if you want to understand it better, I would recommend going and looking at what they've done. Now, everything shifted in January. LLaMA was one of the biggest shifts, and I think when you look at the history books, you'll see LLaMA as being one of the most significant changes in AI. DeepSeek, Chinese company, been talking in the open for about 5 years about what they're doing. China's been really clear on its open source strategy for the last 5 years, if you should choose to follow it. DeepSeek in January published R1, which, as you will all know, reduced the cost of an LLM, but it was built on top of LLaMA. It used LLaMA, it distilled LLaMA to do that. So you see the openness that we thought was a good thing back in July 23, enabling DeepSeek to iteratively innovate on top of LLaMA, distilling LLaMA to create R1. 5 million for an LLM. Prior to that was 100 million. You saw NVIDIA's stock price collapse. I think it's called Miller's Law. I can't remember which law it is, but there's one law of tech, which is or a law of work, that you fill the working day. So if you reduce the number of tasks you've got to do, you'll still find things to do to fill the working day. And I think that's basically what will happen with data centers that are processing AI. So NVIDIA will be fine. The stock price didn't go down for long. But it was a massive thing, and it brought global attention to open source AI. And it brought about a conversation on sovereignty and whether we need LLMs to be built in country, whether we need to localize them. This whole sovereignty piece is something where people can't even agree on what it means, but it's had an impact, and that impact has seen the US in its AI action plan this summer say that it's going to support open models and weights. And I think that's a better way of describing these open language models. It doesn't say how it's going to do it, but what that's led to, a combination of DeepSeek and the US government approach, what it's led to this summer is the first open language models from OpenAI. So you think, well, that's it over, it's time to go home. Unfortunately, we still have a lot of challenges. A couple of years ago, you would have seen Rishi Sunak do the first AI summit at Bletchley, focusing on security. Paris, which we did the report on, started to focus on action. When he opened the summit in Paris, Prime Minister Modi of India, who co-hosted it, talked about access. And we're seeing the Indian AI Impact Summit in February next year, looking at these global holistic sutras and chakras for humanity, all of which come back to access and digital public good. And that access and digital public good is how we see open source and AI evolving, and what I think you're going to see more and more talked about. Quick plug for our conference in February. This conversation will be vastly bigger, with half a dozen tracks of people talking about all the different aspects of openness, all of which currently come back to AI. And if you want to follow up on anything or contact me,